And then we have Charlie Hebdo. And is that connected to De Gaulle, Moro, Breivik? I believe it is in this sense. On January 5th, President François Hollande, right, he's been very unsuccessful. This is a guy who ran for office saying that he was against austerity. And as of yesterday, they have just rammed through a very serious and draconian austerity law, right? It makes it easier to trample on the rights of working people. But anyway, Hollande is he's someone who's adrift politically. But certainly in his news conference of January 5th, when he started the new political year, he made a very interesting statement. Hollande said, the sanctions against Russia must end. Must end. That's a very strong statement for such a weak politician. And, of course, what he's responding to is there are these two big helicopter carriers or amphibious assault ships, which France would like to sell to Russia. They have sold them. They should deliver them is now the issue. Will they deliver them or not? And the U.S. is obviously blocking that, and with the help of the British. So he came out and said the sanctions must end. France will not occupy Libya. That was another issue. And thirdly, the Greeks can elect whomever they want. Now, all of those were pure heresy from the NATO line, because the NATO line on Greece was that if you elect Syriza and Alexis Tsipras, then you're going to have the end of the world, chaos, delirium, and so forth. And so he said the opposite. He said, yeah, go and elect whoever you want, and then please respect your requirements. But this was not the hysteria that they wanted. Well, within 48 hours, shooting started. The details are always murky. The shooting at the Charlie Hebdo editorial headquarters had started. And sure enough, there had been a summit scheduled already around the 10th or so of January in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, and that was going to be Putin of Russia, Poroshenko of Ukraine, the NATO puppet, plus Merkel, plus Hollande, and that was just swept away, right? That was swept away in these marches and other events that took place in Paris. So it meant that the timetable for essentially trying to come to grips with a political solution for the Ukraine had been thrown back, and for the moment at least, Hollande stopped talking about ending the sanctions. Now, that tendency of the French to lead a rebellion against the sanctions, in my view, is back again, right? It's there, and you can see it in the relaxed and nonchalant French response to these events in Debaltseve, right? Because what's happening in Debaltseve is the army, essentially the Ukrainian army, is trapped in that pocket. And you may say, well, that's only 8,000. It was only 8,000 when it began to collapse, right? Some of them have gotten out with their weapons, not that many, and a lot of them have simply laid down their arms and have marched out. And the Russians and the pro-Russian side has given them a kind of a lecture saying you should not kill civilians, and now you go home and get out of here. They're very lucky. But that has happened, and that's it essentially means that the offensive capability of the Ukrainian army is gone. And that was the whole hysteria. Why Minsk had to be staged on such a short notice was that they were trying desperately to save this main force unit of the Ukrainian army from being essentially wiped out. Right? For some of them, it's been to sneak out with their guns, but for most of them, it's a kind of a Dunkirk, right? For the Ukrainian army. So it means that there's a rebellion inside NATO, and if the French are rebelling, right, you can obviously see who the other pro-Russian forces are, right? Putin was in Hungary yesterday. Now you're going to hear a torrent of abuse about Prime Minister Orban of Hungary and what a bad guy he is, and certainly we don't want to endorse his policies on many issues, but still, the idea is that he represents at least this bedrock of rationality. You want to avoid war at any cost. There's nothing at stake here in Ukraine that's worth World War III. Look at your children. Look at your home, your family. Look at yourself in the mirror, if that's all you can do. None of that is worth risking for this extremely ill-considered, irresponsible U.S.-British policy. So that has been going on. And the other bedrock, of course, is you want to have normal economic relations. So no war, and instead have normal trade. So that's Orban. I think there's a strong undercurrent in the Italian government. Renzi, you have to remember, Italy was in Soviet Russia in the 1920s, even before there was a Soviet Union. And you may remember the car that's sometimes called the Lada is actually a Fiat 124. They had a plant, a factory that built those in Kaliningrad, right, in the Soviet Union. So there's a very deep economic relation there. Germany, it goes without saying, this is extremely strong. There's a direct pipeline from Russia to Germany, and it comes down the bottom of the Baltic. Nobody can cut it off without tampering with this thing that's sitting on the bottom of the ocean. So the Germans have every reason to be strongly in favor. But, of course, Mrs. Merkel, her mind is clouded by ideology and other things, right? She's a very dysfunctional personality, I must say. Although sometimes she's useful, more often she's not. So this is a bad deal for Germany. So you could add probably Slovakia, a couple of others, right? There's a growing group inside NATO that says the Ukrainian policy is insanity. And, of course, for them it looms rather larger than it does here for us, right? Because they're right up against it. Right? In some cases, they can see Russia from their houses. So they take this quite seriously. So I think there's a kind of a rebellion going on, and we're going to see. Concerning this Debaltseve, if we just want to touch on that for a minute.
Well, yeah, Webster, I'd like you to talk about that. And, in fact, I had a phone call from a friend of mine yesterday who was planning a trip to the Ukraine because he has friends who live there. They don't even live in the eastern part of the Ukraine. They live in the central part. And his friends told him, don't come. Don't come. It's very dangerous. Now, these people that live in central Ukraine, friends of his, say they cannot even drive around in their car anymore because they get stopped by the Ukrainian army and who want to conscript young Ukrainian men into the army. So they say they can't even drive around anymore.
Yeah, we should probably spend some time talking about this because we're approaching the first anniversary of this Maidan coup, and this was a bloody, armed, cynical coup d'etat, right, on February 20th or 21st, however you want to count it, of last year, right, what started this entire tragic situation going. First of all, in terms of the impressment, right, because those are press gangs, right, we know them from the War of 1812, right, they go around and grab you and make you sign up. There have been 4 calls for total national mobilization issued by these post-Maidan illegal coup governments. And it starts with Yatsenyuk, remember, as Victoria Nuland, the neocon Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, said last year, right, we want yachts as the finance minister and prime minister, because he has the experience capitulating to the IMF and the European Central Bank and the rest of the Troika, right, the European Commission. So she was out there for him, but the stuff that government has been going on for a year almost now. They've issued 4 calls for mobilization, right, total mobilization, and the results have been extremely meager. Most people run in the other direction. Even the people around the city of Lvov, also known as Lviv or Lemberg, maybe, because it's been under any number of different governments, right, any different number of nations. People just don't come out. They run the other way. And that's essentially what's facing President Poroshenko, right, the chocolate king. It's hard not to call him Pornoshenko because his policies are indeed obscene. He's in power now, and he's trying to scrape up cannon fodder, quite frankly, to throw against the pro-Russian separatists, and I guess we have to assume there are at least, Russian advisors and some Russian equipment and other things, right? I don't see how it could be otherwise. I don't think this is a big surprise or a big issue, given the fact that the U.S., undoubtedly, there are all kinds of U.S. military contractors fighting on the side of the Ukrainian regime. So it's tit for tat, as they say. So this Poroshenko Yatsenyuk regime is extremely unpopular, and they've just been taking people and throwing them into the mix. And their method has been something like this: you get a fairly significant town or a small city or something like this in the east of Ukraine, and what happens is the Ukrainian professional standing army drive up, and they have these self-propelled howitzers and tanks and mortars and artillery pieces, and they start shooting up the town, wantonly killing civilians, right? No attempt to discriminate. And they shoot and shoot and shoot, and a bunch of people get killed. They're driven into their cellars. And then there are these other units, the so-called National Guard. The National Guard are, I have to say, fascists to a very large degree. They come primarily from the far west of Ukraine, this Lvov-Lemberg area, and they come all the way across, and then once the bombardment is finished, the National Guard, and this means the right sector of Yarosh or other battalions or brigades, the Azov Brigade and other sort of ad hoc groups, right? These are glorified fascist gangs. And they then go into the town and engage in house-to-house combat with the pro-Russian separatists. And this is where you get your huge humanitarian emergency. And that's the model. Now, I have to remind people, that is exactly the model of the SS, right? The so-called Einsatzgruppe was just that, right? You'd have the German troops outside the town, and then they would send in, for the massacres, they would quite often send in these so-called volunteer forces who were from local ethnic groups who hated the people in the town, and then they would go to work with these massacres in effect. So that's what it is. Poroshenko is now quite desperate. Here's the thing that happened at Minsk last week. You remember this was 18 hours of discussions, haggling among Hollande of France, Merkel of Germany, Putin of Russia, and Poroshenko for the Ukraine. And the big issue then was, would there be a ceasefire? There should be a ceasefire. Putin kept insisting. He would say to Poroshenko, look, we have these 8,000 to 10,000 Ukrainian forces that are trapped, right, pocketed, bottled up, surrounded, encircled in Debaltseve. And we should address this in the peace deal, right? The communique should talk about them. And the response from Poroshenko was, there is no encirclement. Our forces are doing great. You're crazy. That's propaganda. My guys are actually winning, right? If anything, they're surrounding the other side. So the short-term public relations needs of Poroshenko were allowed to outweigh the need of these Ukrainian regular army people and indeed these right sector characters. They counted for nothing, right? What counted was that Poroshenko didn't want to have to admit abjectly at Minsk, my forces are surrounded, and I would like to have them, lay down their arms and then march out with some dignity and go home. No, he had to deny the fact for a week. So for him to be able to deny the encirclement for 1 week has now led to many, many, many useless deaths. And the deaths have not ended, because although quite a number of the Ukrainian forces have given up their guns and marched out, you can see these things. You can look at my Twitter feed if you want to see some pictures that I've gleaned across the internet. There's also some of them got out with their weapons, but then there are also several thousand that are still there. And what's going to happen with them? Are they going to be the last samurai, right? Are they going to insist on staying there to the death? I certainly hope not, because it's not a worthy cause. But that could have been addressed last week, but Poroshenko said no. Now, everybody in Ukraine can see this. There are demonstrations regularly now at the office of the Ukrainian military general staff, and also at Poroshenko's offices, saying, first of all, why don't you supply our troops? Why don't they have any food, right? Because the idea is that the Poroshenko people are stealing the money, stealing the military appropriations that could be used to purchase supplies and deliver them. No, that doesn't happen because the money gets siphoned off, right? It's a kleptocracy with Poroshenko. And then, of course, they wonder why didn't you give the order to get out of there when you could have, right? This is Debaltseve. It's a kind of a railroad junction and road junction. It's sort of a transportation hub for the area between Lugansk and Donetsk, right? These two provinces of the eastern Ukraine. So he simply ignored it. But now there are a lot of people who really hate Poroshenko, and in particular, anybody who gets out of the pocket and goes home is going to have a horrendous, harrowing tale to tell, and all it takes is one or two for every village and town, and I think you're going to see some serious backlash against Poroshenko for his cynicism. In other words, here's somebody, he takes orders from Nuland, he takes orders from Kerry, maybe from Breedlove. General Philip Breedlove is the NATO commander, U.S. Air Force general. He runs NATO from Belgium. And then there are some others. There's a guy called Ben Hodges. He's the head. He's another general. He's the head of the U.S. Army in Europe, U.S. Army European Command. That's quite a big thing. And they're undoubtedly all telling him, hang on, we'll come through. And we just had, of all things, Ashton Carter, Obama's very ill-advised new choice to be the Secretary of Defense. When he was asked during his hearings, what should you do? And he said, well, I would recommend that Obama send sophisticated U.S. weapons to the Ukrainian forces. And I think this is a very bad idea. Maybe just a couple of things about that, right? Why we don't want World War III, in case there's any doubt about it, here on the Pacifica Anti-War Network, and that deserves to be honored, in particular in this case, because it's very scary. There's been an article published in, I guess it's the Moscow Times, something you can look at from time to time. That's United Press International from Moscow, but at least they do have some things in there. And they tell you that a group of Moscow think tanks were called by their reporter, and all the Moscow think tanks say that Russian government and the Russian people would regard U.S. direct, open, public weapons deliveries of sophisticated arms to the Ukrainian side. That would be considered an act of war. So, act of war against Russia. Whether you like it or not, they say it's an act of war. Is that worth it? Right? Is that worth, well, if you remember, the day after, right, with Jason Robards, you want to get into that kind of a world? If you haven't seen it, it's a good time to see it. This is the time when it would do a lot of good, and 30 years ago, but this is now where we are. You don't want this. The other thing that the Moscow think tanks say is if you had the U.S. delivering these weapons, there would be an asymmetrical Russian response. Well, we know in the Cold War, the asymmetrical Russian response was, if you mess with Cuba, we'll take Berlin, something like that. Right? That was asymmetrical in those days. Today, asymmetrical could mean what? It could mean, as one of the people in this quoted in the article, most of them sort of anonymous, not completely, but some, they say, well, in the Middle East, it would be easy to mount an operation to attack Saudi Arabia. There would be people who would be interested in doing that, and Russia could make sure that would happen. And, of course, if you attack Saudi Arabia, you're going to sink the dollar. You're going to have chaos in world energy markets and so forth. And there's a history with that, too, right? You know that Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia went to Putin 14 months ago before the Olympics, and Bandar said, look, Putin, you stop supporting President Assad of Syria, and if you don't stop that support, Bandar of Saudi Arabia, will unleash terrorism on your Olympics. And in a sense, this in a general way, that's the kind of world we've now entered.